Her grandmother spent years hiding a secret that weighed heavily on her soul. But when something unexpected happened in her small home, everything changed in an instant. What she did next will touch even the hardest heart. Watch until the end, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more emotional stories like this. For as long as Eileen could remember, the attic bedroom above the kitchen was her sanctuary. Small, cramped, with peeling wallpaper, and a single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. In the summer, the humidity clung to her skin like a second layer, and in the winter, the icy drafts seeped through the cracked window panes, numbing her fingers and toes. Yet, in all that discomfort, it was hers, the only place she could call safe. Every night, the house creaked and sighed like a tired old beast settling in for the dark. The kitchen light dimmed and flickered before dying out completely, leaving the house swallowed by shadows. It was then the noises started. The basement door's slow, deliberate creak, the heavy thud of boots on wooden stairs, the unmistakable stench of cheap tobacco filling the air, wrapping around the stale heat of the summer night, or the cold breath of winter's chill. Eileen's mother always pretended not to hear. She said it was because of the double shifts at the diner, that she was so exhausted by the time she reached their shared bedroom that nothing could wake her. But Eileen knew better. She saw the way her mother's hands trembled just beneath the covers, how her eyes never truly closed, how her breath hitched when the noises grew louder, closer. And worse than the sounds was the silence of another presence. Someone else listening. Someone who chose silence like a shield. Her stepfather, Dale, was a man that everyone in Millbridge knew. He was the kind of man who helped neighbors mend fences without a second thought, who taught Sunday school with a smile that stretched too wide and too forced, who greeted everyone at the grocery store with that same too bright grin. But when the sky darkened and the streetlights flickered on, Dale became someone unrecognizable, someone Eileen barely dared to breathe near. At 12 years old, Eileen gathered every ounce of bravery she could muster and whispered the truth to her mother. Just a single fragile whisper meant to shatter the facade. But her mother's voice was sharp, like glass breaking on cold tile. "Don't start," she said. "You want to tear this family apart?" That was the night Eileen learned to swallow her voice, to fold it tight inside her chest, where it could neither escape nor make a sound. Her body grew over the years, but her soul shrank, hidden in shadows only she could see. By 16, the house felt like a prison, and the ghosts of silence suffocated her. One night she ran, taking nothing but a battered backpack and a vow. She swore she would never let history repeat itself. Years slipped by like shadows at dusk. Eileen built a life of quiet resilience, raising her own children with fierce love and careful protection. She became a grandmother earlier than most. Her granddaughter's laughter and bright eyes a balm for the years of pain she carried like an old wound beneath her skin. But some wounds never heal. One ordinary afternoon, after picking her granddaughter up from Fairway Elementary, Eileen heard words she could not erase. "Uncle Rick sometimes comes into my room when Mom's asleep." The room spun beneath her feet. Different house, different names, different faces. But the signs were the same. The creeping fear, the silence, the betrayal that echoed louder than any words. She confronted her daughter, desperate for the truth, for the protection she had once wished for herself. But her words met only fury and denial. "You're projecting," her daughter spat, eyes burning with something Eileen couldn't place. "You've always been stuck in the past, Mom. Just let it go." But Eileen knew. She saw the pain hiding behind the mask, knew the silence that screamed louder than any outcry, the look in her granddaughter's eyes, too old, too tired, for a child, cut deeper than any lie. That night, for the first time in decades, Eileen chose to speak. Not in whispers, not in silences. She spoke loudly, shouted the truth she had buried for so long. She reported what she knew, what she feared, and in return she was labeled crazy, cast out by the family she once called her own. Now, Eileen lives alone in a subsidized studio apartment, the walls thin, the window facing a quiet street she barely recognizes. The rain still gets in through the cracks, the cold still bites at her bones in the dead of night. But inside she feels something she never knew before, peace. Because this time she did not pretend to sleep. And maybe, just maybe, this time, the silence was finally broken. Eileen's childhood memories were painted in shades of gray and blue, tinged with the oppressive weight of fear and loneliness. She remembered the small round window of the attic bedroom, the only view she had of the outside world, framed by cracked wooden panels that whispered secrets when the wind blew. The kitchen below was always dark when she climbed the stairs, the smell of burnt coffee mixing with the faint, metallic scent of old pipes. The house itself was a silent witness to nights she wished she could forget. She could still hear the basement door creaking, slow, heavy, deliberate. Each time like a countdown to something terrible. The sound of boots on the stairs was louder than her own heartbeat, the steps echoing through the hollow spaces in the walls. But it wasn't just the sounds that terrified her. It was the stillness that followed, the silence that wrapped around the house like a thick fog. The silence that told her mother was listening, but choosing not to hear. Eileen remembered the night she tried to break free. At 12, her small frame trembling, she had spoken words she thought might save them all. "Mom, he's hurting me." The room had gone cold. Her mother's face had hardened, eyes sharp and unyielding. "Don't start," she had said again. "You want to tear this family apart?" That night, the attic bedroom didn't feel safe anymore. It became a cage of silence, where Eileen learned that love could sometimes be a prison. Her stepfather, Dale, was a man with two faces. To the world, he was kind and dependable. To Eileen, he was a shadow lurking in every corner. She had seen the smile he gave at church, but she had also felt the weight of his hands when no one else was watching. When she finally ran at 16, the cold night air hit her like a slap. She left behind everything, the house, the memories, the silence, carrying only a backpack and a vow to never let that life catch her again. Years passed. Eileen built a fragile life stitched together with the love she poured into her children, and later, her granddaughter. But the past was never far. It lived in the small moments, in the way her granddaughter's eyes darted nervously, in the words the child whispered one afternoon. "Uncle Rick sometimes comes into my room when Mom's asleep." Eileen felt the old fear rise, bitter and sharp. Different names, different house. But the same silence, the same betrayal. She confronted her daughter, desperate to protect her granddaughter. But the response was cold and sharp. "You're stuck in the past, Mom. You don't understand." That night, for the first time in decades, Eileen chose not to be silent. She reported the truth, and the price was exile. Now, alone in her small apartment, the rain tapping on the window, Eileen felt the weight of years lift slightly. The silence was broken, the nightmare faced. For the first time she could sleep. The clock on the wall ticked slowly, marking the passing hours with a cruel patience. Eileen sat by the window, watching the rain streak down the glass in uneven lines. The world outside was blurry, as if seen through a veil of tears. The past was never far, but tonight it felt less like a prison and more like a battle she was finally winning. And yet, a whisper of doubt lingered. Was this truly the end? Or was there still a shadow waiting to rise? Her breath caught in her throat as a sudden knock on the door shattered the quiet. Eileen's heart hammered in her chest. Someone was there. The night was far from over. Eileen never imagined that returning to that silence would be so loud. The days after she reported, everything felt like walking through a storm with no shelter. The phone stopped ringing. The neighbors averted their eyes. The family she once believed in closed its doors, leaving her outside in the cold. Her daughter's anger was a thunderstorm she could not outrun. "You ruined us," she spat once, voice raw and trembling. "You're tearing this family apart for nothing." But Eileen knew the truth. There was nothing about the fear she saw in her granddaughter's eyes. Nothing about the way the little girl flinched when her uncle smiled. Her granddaughter, Lily, was a quiet child with soft brown curls and eyes that held too much for her young age. Eileen had watched her grow, loved her fiercely, as if shielding her with every breath. But now, that fierce love twisted into a desperate ache. Days blended into nights. Eileen's studio apartment, small and sparse, became a fortress of fragile hope and relentless worry. She decorated the tiny space with photographs, black and white pictures of Lily laughing in the sunshine, family snapshots from better times before the shadows fell. The apartment smelled faintly of lavender and old books, a refuge from the cold outside and colder memories inside. Lily stayed with her often now, when her mother needed space, or when fear crept too close to the surface. They shared quiet evenings wrapped in blankets, eating popcorn and watching old movies, trying to stitch together moments of joy from the torn fabric of their lives. But even in those moments, the silence between them was thick, a heavy weight neither knew how to lift. Lily's eyes sometimes darted to the door, as if expecting someone to break in. Eileen caught herself holding her breath, heart pounding in her chest, a cold knot tightening in her stomach. One night, Lily woke up screaming. Eileen rushed to her side, brushing damp hair from her forehead, rocking her gently. "It was Uncle Rick?" Lily whispered between sobs. "He was in my room again." Eileen's hands trembled as she held her granddaughter close, tears stinging her own eyes. The past wasn't just a memory anymore. It was here, creeping back, dragging them both into its dark depths. Eileen's mind raced with memories she had buried for years. The nights in the attic, the silent screams, the heavy footsteps on the stairs. She saw the lines on her mother's face, the exhaustion mixed with fear, the way she pretended not to hear. The same silence now haunted Lily, a terrible echo through the generations. Determined not to let history repeat itself, Eileen made a decision. She would fight for Lily. She would be loud, unyielding, a wall against the darkness, but the fight would come at a cost. Her daughter's rejection was immediate and fierce. "You're tearing us apart," she accused, voice tight with anger and shame. "You don't understand. You never have." Eileen tried to explain, tried to reach the woman who once was her little girl. But the walls only grew higher, the silence deeper. The town of Millbridge watched quietly, gossiping behind closed doors. Some offered support, others judgment. The cracks in Eileen's world deepened. She began attending support groups for women like her, women who had lived through pain no one dared speak about. The stories she heard mirrored her own, a painful tapestry of suffering and survival. The meetings were raw, filled with tears and shared strength. For the first time in years, Eileen felt less alone. But the fight outside was only half the battle. Inside her own heart, the battle raged on. Eileen's nights were restless. Sleep came in fits, haunted by nightmares and memories. She often woke to the sound of footsteps, the echo of cheap tobacco, the heavy creak of the basement door. Sometimes she found herself staring out the window, watching shadows move across the street, waiting for a peace that seemed just out of reach. One evening, a knock at her door startled her. It was a woman from the support group, a soft-spoken neighbor named Grace, who had become a lifeline. Grace brought casseroles and company, listening without judgment. That night, as they shared stories, Eileen's resolve strengthened. "I won't let this silence win," she said quietly, more to herself than to Grace. "Not this time." The months passed with slow, painful progress. Eileen worked tirelessly to protect Lily, helping her granddaughter find her voice through therapy and gentle encouragement. The sparkle slowly returned to Lily's eyes, though the shadows never fully disappeared. Eileen's own wounds, though invisible, began to heal as well. She found strength in small victories. A smile from Lily, a word of encouragement from a stranger, the simple act of waking each morning ready to face the day. Yet the tension within her family simmered just beneath the surface. At times, her daughter's coldness cut deeper than the past ever could. Family gatherings became minefields, words sharp and eyes accusing. Eileen learned to navigate the fractured relationships, protecting Lily above all else. But the hardest part was the loneliness, the way the world seemed to turn its back when she needed it most, the way love sometimes wasn't enough to heal. Broken trust. One bitterly cold winter night, the apartment's heater sputtered and died. The chill seeped into Eileen's bones as she wrapped Lily tighter in blankets. Outside, the snow fell silently, muffling the sounds of the world. Inside, a different kind of silence filled the small space. The silence of fear, waiting, and hope intertwined. Eileen looked at her granddaughter sleeping peacefully beside her and whispered a promise she hoped would never break. "I will keep you safe," she said, "no matter what." The storm outside raged on, but inside, a fragile light flickered, a light born of love, courage, and the fierce refusal to be silenced again. Months later, Eileen found herself back in the old neighborhood. The streets of Millbridge had changed little, but everything felt different. She walked slowly past, the houses' memories rising like ghosts with every step, the smell of fresh-cut grass, the distant laughter of children, the crackling sound of leaves underfoot, all reminders of a life she had left behind but could never forget. Her heart ached for the little girl she once was, scared, silent, alone in the attic bedroom. But she also felt pride for the woman she had become. Scarred, yes, but unbroken. Eileen visited the local library, where she spent hours researching ways to help children like Lily. She connected with counselors, advocates, and teachers, weaving a network of support that felt like a lifeline. One afternoon, as she sat in the quiet corner of the library, a woman approached. Her face was kind but tired, eyes reflecting a story Eileen recognized immediately. "I heard about what you're doing," the woman said softly. "You're giving others a voice." Eileen nodded, a lump rising in her throat. "It's the least I can do." That meeting sparked a new purpose. Together they organized community talks and workshops, opening conversations that had long been buried under layers of fear and silence. Slowly the town began to shift, awareness growing, walls crumbling. But change was never easy. There were setbacks, whispers behind backs, cold shoulders in stores. Eileen felt the weight of judgment, the sting of isolation. Yet she pressed on, fueled by the memory of her granddaughter's frightened eyes and the promise she made long ago. One chilly spring morning, Eileen received a call that shook her to her core. Lily's mother had agreed to family counseling, a tentative step toward healing fractured bonds. Eileen's heart fluttered with cautious hope. Maybe, after all this pain, the silence would finally be broken for good. She prepared for the sessions with trembling hands and a fierce determination. The first meeting was awkward, filled with years of unspoken pain and mistrust. But beneath the tension, a fragile thread of understanding began to form. Eileen listened as her daughter spoke of her own fears and regrets, of the impossible choices she faced trying to protect her family. The walls between them cracked, revealing wounds that ran deeper than anger. Slowly, painfully, healing began. But life is never without its shadows. One evening, as Eileen tucked Lily into bed, the little girl's smile faltered. "Grandma," she whispered, voice barely audible. "Sometimes, I still get scared." Eileen pulled her close, whispering words she wished were stronger than any fear. "I'm here," she promised. "Always." The road ahead was long and uncertain, but together they faced it, not with silence, but with love, courage, and the hard-won strength of survival. Years passed. Eileen's hair grew whiter, her steps slower but steady. Lily blossomed into a young woman, her laughter freer, her eyes brighter. The shadows of the past still lingered, but they no longer ruled their lives. Eileen found peace in small moments. A shared cup of tea, a quiet afternoon in the park, the warmth of family slowly knitting itself back together. The scars remained, but they were no longer chains. One afternoon, sitting by the window, Eileen reflected on the long journey, from the attic bedroom where fear first took root, to the battles fought in silence and in light, the years of pain, rejection, and resilience. She smiled softly, a tear tracing a line down her cheek. The silence was broken. The darkness held no power here anymore. And finally, she was free. The morning sun filtered softly through the thin curtains of Eileen's modest studio apartment. The gentle light stretched across the worn floorboards and touched the familiar photographs taped on the peeling walls. Eileen sat quietly at the small kitchen table, a steaming cup of tea in her hands, staring out the window as the city outside began to stir. It was a morning like so many others, yet everything had changed. Her granddaughter, Lily, had grown more vibrant with every passing day. The sparkle in her eyes returned slowly, like spring after a long winter. But the memories, the pain, the fear, they were never far behind. Every smile Lily wore had the shadow of something darker beneath it. And Eileen, who had once lived in silence, knew now the true cost of that quiet. In the weeks since the family counseling began, the fragile threads of their broken family had started to weave a new pattern. It wasn't perfect, and there were days when anger and resentment erupted like storms. But the effort was real. Even Lily's mother, bruised by her own wounds and mistakes, had begun to soften, if only in small ways. For Eileen, this was progress. This morning Eileen prepared for another day of the delicate dance between hope and fear. Her routine was simple but heavy with meaning. She dressed carefully, smoothing the wrinkles from her blouse, folding her hands in her lap, and thinking about the hours ahead. Lily would be at school, her mother at work. Eileen would spend the day volunteering at a local women's center, a place that had become her sanctuary and mission. There she met others who carried burdens like hers, women who understood the silence and the scars it left behind. Together they forged strength from pain. But as she sipped her tea, a cold weight settled in her chest. The past had a way of reaching through the present, unexpected and unyielding. It was the phone call that broke the fragile peace. The voice on the other end was quiet but urgent, a counselor from Lily's school. There was concern about something Lily had said during recess, something about Uncle Rick again. The details were vague but chilling. Eileen's hands trembled. The nightmare was not over. She gathered her coat and keys, her mind racing. She needed to see Lily, to protect her, to find answers. The drive to the school was short but felt endless. The streets of Millbridge passed, by in a blur, familiar faces and places casting long shadows in the early light. At the school, Eileen was greeted with cautious glances. The word had spread. She was the grandmother who had spoken out, who had shaken the family tree until the rotten branches fell. Inside the quiet office, the counselor spoke gently, carefully. Lily had been drawing pictures during art class, scenes that told a story far more troubling than anyone had imagined. Shadows lurking in the corners of her drawings, frightened, figures hiding behind closed doors. The counselor was worried Lily was still trying to find a way to speak the unspeakable. Eileen felt her throat tighten. She nodded silently, grateful for this glimpse into the little girl's hidden world. She left the school with a new resolve. The fight wasn't just about family anymore. It was about breaking a cycle that threatened to swallow Lily whole. That evening, Eileen sat beside her granddaughter's bed, holding her hand through the darkness. Lily's small fingers clutched hers tightly. "Tell me," Eileen whispered, voice soft but firm. "Anything you want. I'm here." For a long time, Lily stayed silent, eyes wide and searching. Then, in a voice trembling with fear and hope, she began. The stories Lily told were fragmented, sometimes confused. The words of a child trying to make sense of things that no child should ever have to understand. She spoke of shadows that came at night, of whispers that didn't belong to the wind, of a silence that screamed. Eileen listened, her heart breaking with each word, each pause, each tear. When Lily's voice finally faded into sleep, Eileen stayed awake, her mind a whirlwind of fear, determination, and a quiet fury that burned deep inside her. The next days were a blur of appointments, meetings, and quiet conversations. Eileen sought help from every corner, therapists, advocates, teachers. Each step felt like walking on broken glass, but she pressed on, fueled by a love that refused to be silenced. At home, tensions ran high. Lily's mother remained distant, caught between denial and guilt. Eileen knew the woman's anger was a shield for her own pain, but it made the house feel cold and fractured. One afternoon, after a particularly difficult conversation, Eileen retreated to her room, exhausted and overwhelmed. As she sat on the edge of her bed, the weight of years pressed down on her. Memories of the attic bedroom came rushing back, the heat, the silence, the fear. She closed her eyes and breathed deeply, reminding herself why she had chosen this path. She would not let silence win. The Women's Center became a beacon in the storm. Eileen's role there evolved quickly. What began as volunteering soon turned into advocacy. She spoke openly at meetings, shared her story when it was asked for, and helped organize support groups for mothers and grandmothers caught in similar struggles. Her voice, once small and silenced, now carried strength. But with that strength came exhaustion and moments of crushing loneliness. One rainy afternoon, after a long day at the center, Eileen returned home to find a note slipped under her door. It was short, chilling in its simplicity. "Leave it alone. Some things are better left buried." The note rattled her deeply. The threat, the warning. It was a reminder that the fight was far from over. But Eileen refused to back down. She locked the door, checked the windows, and sat down to write. This time, not a letter or a report, but a story. Her story, the truth laid bare on the page, raw and unfiltered. Writing was catharsis. It was a way to reclaim power from pain, to turn silence into voice. Winter came early that year, wrapping Millbridge in a blanket of snow and cold. The city slowed under the weight of ice, the streets empty and silent. Inside the apartment, Eileen wrapped herself in layers, sitting by the small heater that struggled to push back the chill. Lily was at school, and the house felt too quiet. She picked up the pen again and wrote about the attic bedroom, about the nights filled with shadows and whispered fears, about the mother who pretended to sleep, about the stepfather whose smile vanished with the sun. She wrote about running away, about becoming a grandmother too soon, about the desperate love for a granddaughter caught in the same nightmare. Her hand shook as she wrote the final words, tears blurring the ink. But in that moment, there was a spark, a flicker of hope shining through the darkness. Spring arrived with hesitant warmth. The snow melted into muddy puddles, and the air filled with the scent of fresh earth and new beginnings. Eileen took Lily to the park one afternoon, watching the little girl chase after pigeons with a laugh that felt fragile, but true. As they sat on a bench, Eileen felt the weight of the past loosen just a little. They talked about school, about friends, about dreams. Lily's smile was brighter, but Eileen knew the healing was still fragile. That night, as Lily slept peacefully, Eileen sat by the window looking out at the quiet street. The silence was no longer empty. It held the promise of something better, a future where fear could be faced and overcome. Months later, Eileen received an invitation to speak at a community event focused on child protection and healing. It was a daunting prospect, but she accepted. Standing before a crowd of strangers, Eileen shared her story. Not just her own, but the stories of countless women and children trapped in silence. Her voice wavered, but her words carried a raw, unyielding truth. The room was silent, then filled with quiet applause. Tears glistened on faces she had never met, and for the first time in a long time, Eileen felt seen. Back at home, the family slowly mended its fractured edges. The counseling sessions continued, bringing painful but necessary conversations. One evening, Lily's mother took Eileen's hand, her eyes soft with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, "for never giving up." Eileen smiled, feeling the walls between them shift just a little. Years later, Eileen sat surrounded by family. Lily grown into a strong young woman, her mother finally at peace, and a community that had learned to listen. The scars of the past remained, but they no longer defined them. Eileen looked around, the room, heartful. The silence had been broken, the darkness had lost, and love, fierce, unyielding love, had won. The morning light crept softly through the thin curtains, casting long, pale beams across the small living room where Eileen sat quietly. The weight of years pressed gently on her shoulders, but there was something different about this day. A subtle shift in the air, a fragile hope that stirred beneath the stillness. She fingered the edges of an old photograph resting on the table, a picture of herself as a young girl, perched in the attic bedroom that had been both refuge and prison. The cramped room seemed so far away now, yet its shadows clung to her, still like an old wound never quite healed. Eileen had lived decades under the heavy silence of secrets and fear, but those years had shaped her into the woman she was today. Resilient, cautious, and fiercely protective of the little light she had managed to save for herself and Lily. This quiet morning was a rare moment of peace before the storm of life began anew. The soft creak of the door announced Lily's arrival, her steps light but uncertain. The granddaughter's face bore a mixture of childish innocence and a weariness no child should carry. Eileen's heart clenched at the sight, but she pushed her own fear aside. Breakfast was a simple affair, with toast and eggs, but the air between them was thick with unsaid words. Lily's eyes darted to the window and back to her grandmother, as if measuring the safety of the room. Eileen understood. She had once been that frightened child, and she had vowed never to let those shadows win again. "Today's the day, Lily," Eileen said softly, her voice steady. "We're going to meet someone who can help us." There was no room for hesitation or doubt. This was the path forward, no matter how jagged. Lily nodded, but her small hand trembled as it slid into Eileen's firm grasp. Outside, the world felt colder than the fragile warmth inside the apartment. The city's streets were slick with recent rain, reflecting the grey sky in pools of uncertainty. As they walked, Eileen's mind wandered to the years lost in silence. The nights spent listening to footsteps on the stairs, the whispered threats that filled the empty spaces between words. She thought of her mother's exhaustion, her stepfather's duplicity, and the long years of quiet that followed. Their destination was a modest community center a few blocks away, a place that had become a sanctuary for women and children who carried hidden wounds. Eileen had found refuge here, among others who understood without needing explanations. Today, however, was different. Today they would meet the counselor who had offered Lily a lifeline, a steady hand to help untangle the knots of fear and confusion. Inside the center, the air was thick with stories. Soft voices echoed through the halls, conversations woven with pain and hope. Eileen watched Lily's wide eyes as she took in the room, sensing the weight of the unknown pressing down. She knelt beside her, offering a quiet smile. The counselor, a woman named Janice, greeted them with a warmth that felt like a balm. Her presence was calm but resolute, and Eileen felt an unfamiliar sense of trust. Janice had a way of listening that made words easier to find, like sunlight breaking through clouds. The session was gentle at first, with Lily drawing pictures and talking about school and friends. But soon, the shadows crept back into the conversation. Lily spoke in fragments about Uncle Rick, the frightening visits, the cold silences. Janice took notes carefully, her eyes never leaving the little girl. Eileen's heart pounded in her chest. Every word was a thread pulling them closer to a truth too painful to fully face. After the session, Janice spoke privately with Eileen, her voice low but urgent. She recommended a series of steps: therapeutic support for Lily, protective measures to ensure her safety, and ongoing counseling for the family. It was a plan grounded in hope, but shadowed by the reality of resistance. Eileen left the center feeling both buoyed and burdened. She knew that the hardest part lay ahead, not just fighting the external threats, but breaking through the walls built by fear and denial within their own family. Back home, the atmosphere was tense. Lily's mother was distant, her face guarded, and sharp with unspoken accusations. The distance between the women was a chasm widened by years of pain and misunderstanding. When Eileen gently brought up the counselor's visit, she was met with cold dismissal. "You're tearing this family apart again," her daughter said sharply. "You've always been stuck in the past, and now you want to drag us all down with you." The words hit Eileen like a physical blow, but she held her ground. "I'm doing this to protect Lily, to protect all of us. We can't keep pretending everything is fine when it's not." The room fell silent, the weight of years pressing down until it felt impossible to breathe. That night, Eileen sat alone in her room, the shadows creeping in from the window like silent witnesses. She pulled out the old journal she had started months ago, a collection of memories, fears, and hopes. As she traced the faded words with her fingers, tears slipped down her cheeks. The pain was raw, but beneath it, a fierce determination burned brighter than ever. She would not be silenced. She would fight for Lily, for herself, for every broken voice longing to be heard. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of challenges. Therapy sessions for Lily began, with slow but steady progress. The little girl learned to put words to her fear, to understand that she was not alone. Eileen sat in on many of these sessions, absorbing every piece of advice, every tool, to help her granddaughter heal. But the home remained a battlefield. Lily's mother vacillated between denial and anger, often pushing Eileen away. The fractured family struggled to find common ground, each woman grappling with her own wounds. One afternoon, after a particularly heated argument, Eileen retreated to the community center. There, surrounded by women who had walked similar paths, she found a measure of peace. They shared stories of betrayal, loss, and survival, each tale a thread in a tapestry of resilience. It was during one of these meetings that Eileen met Margaret, a woman whose quiet strength and gentle wisdom became a beacon. Margaret's own story was one of pain and healing, and her presence reminded Eileen that she was not alone. Together they began organizing workshops and support groups, creating spaces where voices once silenced could rise. But the past, like a shadow, never fully disappeared. One evening, as Eileen returned home, she found a note taped to her door. The message was simple but chilling. "Stop digging, or you'll regret it." Fear clawed at her heart, but she refused to be intimidated. The threat only strengthened her resolve. That night, she locked every door and window, sitting in the dark with a heavy weight pressing on her chest. The silence was no longer peaceful. It was a challenge, a reminder that the battle was far from over. She thought of the attic bedroom where her own nightmares had begun, of the nights filled with whispers and footsteps, and she vowed once more that Lily would never live in that silence. Winter returned, harsh and unforgiving. Snow blanketed the city, muffling the sounds of life but not the ache within Eileen's heart. One bitterly cold morning, she received a call from Lily's school. The little girl had been found wandering the halls, frightened and confused. Teachers reported seeing bruises hidden beneath her sleeves, signs that someone was still hurting her. Eileen's world shattered again. She rushed to the school, her hands trembling as she held Lily close. The child's small body was fragile, but her spirit fought to survive. That night, Eileen stayed awake by Lily's bedside, watching over her with fierce devotion. She knew the road ahead would be long and treacherous, but she would walk it every step with her granddaughter. The new year brought a fresh wave of determination. With the support of the community center and the growing network of advocates, Eileen filed formal complaints, pushing for intervention and protection for Lily. The process was slow, frustrating, and fraught with resistance, but each small victory was a light in the darkness. Eileen also focused on healing herself. Therapy sessions for survivors of trauma helped her face the scars she had buried deep. She learned to forgive herself for the years of silence and to embrace the power in her voice. With every step forward, the shadows receded a little more. Spring arrived once again, soft and tentative. The world outside bloomed with promise, and inside Eileen's apartment, a fragile peace took root. Lily's laughter grew more frequent, her eyes clearer. The little girl began to dream of a future free from fear. One afternoon, as they sat in the park watching the sun dip behind the trees, Eileen reached for Lily's hand. The warmth of the connection was a balm to her soul. "We're going to be okay," Eileen whispered. "I promise." Lily smiled, the first true smile in a long time, and squeezed her grandmother's hand tightly. Years later, surrounded by family and friends, Eileen reflected on the long journey from silence to voice. The scars of the past were still there, but they no longer held power over them. The attic bedroom was a distant memory, a place where a frightened girl once hid. Now, Eileen stood tall, a woman who had turned pain into strength and broken the cycle of silence. As she watched Lily, now grown and full of life, laughter, and hope, Eileen knew that the fight had been worth every tear, every heartbreak, because love had triumphed, because the darkness had finally given way to light. And in that moment, surrounded by the warmth of family, Eileen felt peace. The winter air hung heavy over Millbridge, each breath a sharp reminder of the cold that seemed to seep into every corner of Eileen's life. Even in the safety of her small apartment, warmth was a fragile thing, slipping through her fingers like smoke. The days dragged on, measured not by the clock, but by the quiet struggles that filled each moment. Silent battles fought behind closed doors, invisible to the outside world. Since the last bitter episode at Lily's school, things had changed, but not enough. The bruises, the frightened eyes, the whispered fears, all left scars deeper than any wound on skin. Eileen could see it every time Lily looked away, every time she flinched at a sudden noise. Her granddaughter was trapped in a cage of shadows, and Eileen's heart shattered all over again. It was during one of these bleak mornings when the sky was a dull gray and the snow crunched under her boots that Eileen made a decision that would change everything. She could no longer wait for the system, for others to act. She had to be the shield Lily desperately needed. With a fierce determination, she began researching every possible resource: legal aid, protective services, counselors, advocates. The paperwork piled up, forms and letters that blurred together. But Eileen did not falter. Her own past was a distant echo, but the pain it held fueled her resolve. She remembered the nights spent wide awake in that cramped attic, the silence that wasn't silence at all, but a heavy presence, thick with fear. She remembered her mother's tired eyes and her stepfather's cruel smile. But most of all, she remembered her vow, the promise to break the cycle to stop the shadows from claiming another innocent soul. Days turned into weeks, and the tension within the apartment grew thick enough to suffocate. Lily's mother oscillated between denial and fury, her words cutting sharper than any blade. "You're destroying what little family we have," she spat one afternoon, her voice cold and bitter. "Stop this madness before it's too late." Eileen met her gaze steadily, unyielding. "Madness is letting this go on. I'm fighting for Lily, for all of us." The conversation ended with doors slammed and silence heavier than before. Eileen knew the road ahead was lonely, but she refused to turn back. Every evening after tucking Lily into bed and sitting with her, until the little girl's breathing slowed into sleep, Eileen would retreat to her journal. Words poured out, memories, fears, hopes. Writing was the only way to untangle the knots inside her, to make sense of the chaos swirling around her heart. One night, as the wind howled outside and the city lights flickered, Eileen read through the pages filled with pain and resilience. She traced the lines with trembling fingers, each word a testament to survival. She found strength in her own story, in the quiet defiance that had carried her through decades of silence. Outside the apartment, Millbridge seemed oblivious to the battles waging behind closed doors. The town wore its peaceful mask well. Neighbors, chatting over fences, children playing in snow-dusted yards. The slow rhythm of everyday life moving forward as if nothing was wrong. But Eileen knew better. The shadows lurked in the familiar places. The grocery store where Dale once smiled. The Sunday school where he preached kindness. Though he was gone now, replaced by silence and absence, his presence lingered like a ghost. One afternoon, Eileen received a call that shattered the fragile calm. Lily's mother had left, storming out with a bitter curse. And for the first time, Lily was alone, truly alone, in the house that no longer felt safe. Panic surged through Eileen's veins as she rushed to the apartment. The door was unlocked, the silence suffocating. Lily sat on the couch, clutching a threadbare blanket, eyes wide and unblinking. Eileen gathered her close, whispering promises of safety, of protection. The child's small body trembled against her, the weight of fear palpable. Eileen's own heart ached, remembering all the nights she had wished someone would come for her, would save her from the darkness. That night, Eileen called Janice, the counselor who had become a lifeline. Together they arranged emergency foster care for Lily. An agonizing decision, but one made out of love and necessity. The process was swift and cold. Social workers appeared with clipboards and kind faces that barely hid their fatigue. Lily was wrapped in a soft coat, held tightly by Eileen as she whispered, "I'll be back soon, sweetheart, I promise." Watching her granddaughter walk away was like losing a piece of herself. But it was also a step toward freedom, a chance for Lily to breathe in a world without fear. In the weeks that followed, Eileen found herself standing at a crossroads. The apartment felt emptier without Lily's laughter echoing through the rooms, the photographs, the small toys, the unfinished drawings, each a reminder of the battle still raging just out of sight. But Eileen refused to sink into despair. The fight was far from over. She threw herself into advocacy, joining groups that supported survivors of abuse, speaking at community meetings, sharing her story, in the hope it might light the way for others trapped in darkness. Her voice, once silenced by fear and pain, grew stronger with each word. She found comfort in the sisterhood of women who understood the cost of silence, who carried their own scars like badges of honor. One evening, at a local support group, Margaret pulled Eileen aside. "You're doing more than you know," she said softly. "Your courage is changing lives." Eileen smiled, grateful for the simple truth in those words. It was enough to keep going. Meanwhile, Lily's fostered family provided a sanctuary of warmth and kindness. For the first time, the child experienced a home filled with laughter, safety, and gentle hands. The foster mother, Mrs. Harlan, was patient and tender, encouraging Lily to trust again. Therapy sessions continued, and slowly, the little girl's bright spark began to reemerge. She talked about school, friends, and even the dreams she dared to have. But the shadows still lurked in the quiet moments. The nights when she'd wake, eyes wide with fear, searching for the safety she once knew. Eileen visited as often as she could, holding Lily close, telling stories of strength and hope. The bond between them was a lifeline, unbreakable and fierce. As the months passed, Eileen worked tirelessly to rebuild the fractured family. She reached out to Lily's mother, offering help without judgment, knowing that healing required more than anger and blame. Slowly the walls between them began to crack. Tears were shed, apologies whispered in the quiet hours of the night. The path was rocky and uncertain, but it was real. One cold evening, after a long talk filled with painful truths and fragile promises, Lily's mother said something that surprised Eileen. "I'm scared," she admitted, voice breaking. "But I want to try. For Lily. For us." Eileen nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. "We'll take it one step at a time. Together." Spring blossomed with new beginnings. The family, still fragile but growing stronger, began to find their way back to each other. Lily returned home under careful supervision, the house slowly, transforming from a place of fear to one of healing. Eileen watched with cautious hope as the shadows retreated, replaced by the soft light of trust and love. The attic bedroom, once a prison, became a symbol of survival, a reminder of the past but no longer a place of fear. Lily painted pictures on the walls, filling the room with color and laughter. Eileen helped patch the cracks in the ceiling, a metaphor for the healing taking place within their hearts. On a quiet afternoon, as the sun filtered through blooming trees, Eileen sat with Lily in the garden. The little girl's hand was small and warm in hers, a tangible reminder of the fight they had endured. "We're safe now," Eileen said softly. "And we're never going back." Lily smiled, the first smile free from fear in a long time. Eileen felt the weight on her chest lift, replaced by a fragile but fierce hope. The road had been long and painful, filled with suffering that tested every part of their souls. But they had survived. They had broken the silence. They had reclaimed their lives. And in the quiet that followed, Eileen knew. This was just the beginning of their story. Spring gave way to summer, and with the change in season, a fragile sense of normalcy began to weave itself into the lives of Eileen, Lily, and her mother. The house no longer echoed with silence, weighed down by fear, but carried the tentative sounds of healing, soft laughter, quiet conversations, and the occasional thud of a ball bouncing against the kitchen wall. Eileen's heart still carried the heavy shadows of the past, but now they were tempered with moments of light. Every day was a careful balancing act between hope and pain, between trust and the cautious guarding of wounds that refused to fully heal. She was learning to live again, not just survive, and that was something she had never thought possible. Lily's mother was trying too. There were no grand gestures or sudden transformations, just small steps, calling a counselor, attending support groups, sitting quietly beside her daughter during sleepless nights. She was fragile and flawed, but Eileen could see a genuine effort to be different, to break free from the cycle that had nearly destroyed them all. The evenings were often the hardest. When the world outside quieted down, the ghosts of the past whispered loudest. Eileen would sit by the window of her old attic bedroom, watching the stars flicker against the dark sky. The room had changed little, but now it felt less like a prison and more like a sanctuary, a place where memories were held but no longer controlled her. She kept a small photo album on the bedside table, filled with pictures of Lily growing up, each page a testament to survival and love. Sometimes, when the weight of everything pressed too hard, she would trace the images with trembling fingers, reminding herself of the promise she had made so long ago. One evening, as a summer thunderstorm rumbled in the distance, Eileen received a letter in the mail. The envelope was plain, unassuming, but the handwriting jolted her heart. It was from Dale's sister, a woman Eileen had never met but had heard whispers about over the years. Someone who might hold answers to the shadows that haunted her childhood. With trembling hands, she opened the letter. The words inside were cautious but kind. Dale's sister, Marjorie, wrote about her own struggles, how she had left the family long ago, unable to bear the darkness that Dale brought. She spoke of regrets, secrets kept, and a desire to finally shed light on what had been buried for too long. Marjorie's letter was an invitation, an offer to meet, to share stories, to confront the past together. Eileen felt a rush of conflicting emotions. Part of her wanted to reject the possibility of reopening old wounds. Another part, smaller but persistent, saw a chance to understand, to perhaps find the closure that had eluded her for decades. After days of restless nights and careful thought, Eileen decided to respond. She wrote back with cautious hope, agreeing to meet Marjorie in a small cafe in Millbridge. The meeting was quiet at first. Two women, strangers in many ways, bound by the same painful history. Marjorie was older, her face lined with years of sorrow and regret. She spoke softly, recounting memories that echoed Eileen's own. Times of fear, silence, and the desperate need to escape. But there were also revelations. Marjorie shared stories of others in the family who had turned away, who had chosen to protect themselves rather than confront the truth. She confessed how isolated she had felt, trapped between loyalty and the desire to protect the innocent. As the conversation deepened, Eileen felt a weight lift, just slightly. For the first time, the darkness wasn't hers alone to carry. They were two pieces of the same broken puzzle, trying to find a way to fit together. In the days that followed, Eileen found herself thinking more about forgiveness, not just for Dale or those who had turned away, but for herself. she realized how much of her suffering had been compounded by the bitterness she held inside, the anger that ate at her peace. The process wasn't quick or easy. Some nights the past would claw its way back, threatening to drag her under. But slowly, with each step toward understanding, the grip loosened. Meanwhile, Lily continued to blossom. Therapy sessions became a safe space for her to untangle the confusion and fear that had settled deep within. She found joy in small things: painting, playing with friends, the gentle care of her foster family, who remained a steady presence in her life. One afternoon, Eileen watched Lily run across the yard, her laughter ringing clear and free. It was a sound Eileen had longed to hear, a sound that filled the cracks in her soul and reminded her that healing was real. There were moments of tension, of course. The mother's fragile recovery meant old fears sometimes flared. Arguments that left wounds reopening, trust tested again and again. But through it all, Eileen remained a constant, a steady force of love and support. She also took steps to ensure that Lily's safety was never in question again. Meetings with social workers, legal consultations, and the slow rebuilding of a support network around her granddaughter became part of her new life. Eileen was no longer willing to stand on the sidelines. She was a warrior, in the truest sense. One evening, as summer began to fade into the cool colors of fall, Eileen received a call from Lily's school counselor. There had been an incident. A child at school had spoken up, revealing knowledge of the abuse that stunned the small community once again. This time, however, the response was different. There was swift action, a protective plan put into place that involved teachers, counselors, and the family working together. The past's long shadow had been replaced by a commitment to safeguard the future. That night, as Eileen tucked Lily into bed, she whispered a promise, a vow renewed, that no harm would ever come to her again. The little girl looked up at her, eyes shining with trust and a hint of hope. Eileen held her close, feeling the weight of all they had endured and the fragile beauty of what lay ahead. The journey was far from over, but for the first time, in decades, the darkness had been pierced by light. The weeks turned into months, and Eileen found herself embracing the unexpected gift of peace. She joined a local community group for survivors and advocates, sharing her story with quiet strength. The women she met became like family, their shared experiences weaving a tapestry of resilience and hope. Her relationship with Lily's mother, though still complicated, softened with time. They found moments of understanding, places where love could grow despite the scars. Eileen also began volunteering at a local shelter, offering support to women and children who faced the same battles she had once known all too well. It was exhausting work, but deeply fulfilling, a way to turn pain into purpose. The attic bedroom, once a symbol of suffering, was slowly transformed. Eileen painted the walls soft blue, hung curtains that caught the light, and filled the space with plants and photos that spoke of life and love. She spent many evenings there, writing letters she never sent, imagining conversations she needed to have, and dreaming of a future where silence was broken and healing was possible. One quiet night, as the stars twinkled beyond the window, Eileen realized something profound. The past, with all its darkness, had shaped her, but it did not define her. She was more than the pain she had endured. She was a survivor, a grandmother, a warrior, and most importantly, a woman reclaiming her life. Her journey was a testament to the human spirit's capacity to endure, to fight, and to heal. It was a story not just of suffering, but of courage and hope. A story she would carry with her always. The shadows might always linger at the edges, but they no longer held power over her. Eileen closed her eyes and let the quiet wash over her. a deep peace settling in her bones. The cycle had been broken, and for the first time she truly believed in the promise of a new dawn. The late summer air was thick with the scent of drying grass and distant rain, a subtle reminder that change was inevitable for Eileen. The world outside her modest apartment window mirrored the slow but steady transformation happening within her own life. She had spent so many years caught between shadows and silence that this newfound clarity felt both fragile and precious. Lily, now 9 years old, was growing into a bright and resilient child. Her laughter, once a rare and guarded sound, now filled the house with light. She eagerly embraced her schoolwork, made friends, and allowed herself to dream. Things that had seemed impossible just a short while ago. Watching her granddaughter blossom brought Eileen a cautious hope she had not dared to feel before. The rift with Lily's mother, though still present, had softened over months of therapy, heartfelt conversations, and small acts of kindness. Both women bore scars that would never fully fade, but they were learning to lean on each other, to acknowledge pain without being defined by it. There was an unspoken truce, a fragile bond forged in shared suffering, and a mutual desire to protect Lily. Eileen had grown accustomed to the quiet rhythms of her days. Early morning walks to the nearby park, afternoons spent volunteering. At the women's shelter, evenings tucked in her attic room, reading or writing letters she never sent. She carried her past with a solemn grace, allowing the memories to flow like distant rivers rather than raging floods. One evening the phone rang, breaking the comforting silence. It was Marjorie, Dale's sister, calling with news that startled Eileen. She had uncovered old letters and photographs, hidden away in a trunk she had inherited from her late mother. Among the items was a collection of documents that might shed new light on the family's darkest secrets. Marjorie spoke carefully, her voice laced with both apprehension and relief. "I think it's time, Eileen. Time to finally understand everything, to face the truth we all tried to bury." Eileen agreed to meet her the following week at a small cafe on Main Street. The thought of revisiting those painful memories sent a shiver through her, but the promise of answers kindled a quiet determination. When they met, Marjorie laid out the papers with care. The letters revealed a pattern of denial and complicity extending beyond Dale himself. Family members who had known but stayed silent, fearful of scandal or loss. Yet, amid the shadows, there were glimpses of courage, small acts of kindness and whispered warnings to protect the innocent. The photographs were even more haunting. Images of a younger Dale, smiling and unaware of the future he would bring, alongside moments of tenderness with other family members. The contrast between the faces in those pictures and the man Eileen remembered was jarring. As they talked late into the afternoon, Eileen felt the weight of decades lift slightly. This was more than a reckoning. It was an opportunity to reclaim the narrative, to break the cycle of silence one last time. Back at home, Eileen sat by the window, clutching a faded photograph of her own childhood. The attic bedroom where she had once felt trapped now seemed like a distant place, both terrifying and sacred. She allowed herself to remember the little girl she had been, brave, quiet, and desperate to be heard. The next morning, Eileen visited Lily's school. The principal greeted her warmly, informing her of the support systems in place to ensure Lily's safety and well-being. There were counselors, trusted teachers, and community programs, all working to protect children like Lily from the darkness that once loomed so close. Walking through the halls, Eileen saw children laughing, playing, and learning. She saw hope in their eyes, a future not yet tainted by pain. It stirred something fierce inside her, a resolve to fight not just for her granddaughter but for all, children vulnerable to silence and fear. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Eileen wrote a letter. this time not to someone else but to herself. She wrote of forgiveness, of strength, of the journey from brokenness to healing. The letter was a promise to never forget the past, but to live beyond it, to let love and courage guide her steps. Weeks passed, and the community around Millbridge slowly changed. Conversations about abuse and healing became less taboo, more urgent. Eileen found herself invited to speak at local gatherings, her voice steady and clear as she shared her story. Each time she saw in the eyes of her listeners a flicker of recognition and hope. One afternoon, Lily pulled her close and whispered, "Grandma, I'm going to be okay, aren't I?" Eileen's heart swelled. "Yes, darling. You're going to be more than okay. You're going to be strong, and you're going to shine." The road ahead was long, and not without scars, but for the first time in her life, Eileen felt that the darkest chapters had finally been closed. The silence was broken, and with it came freedom. She was no longer the frightened girl hiding in the attic. She was a woman who had fought through the shadows and found the light. The cold wind sliced through the streets of Millbridge as autumn deepened into early winter, a reminder of the passing time and the fragility of warmth. Eileen stood at the window of her small apartment, watching as the last leaves fell, swirling and twirling in the chill. This was a season of endings and beginnings, and for her, it marked the closing of a long, painful chapter. A chapter she had only recently found the strength to begin to understand. Since confronting the ghosts of her past, since refusing to let silence rule her family any longer, Eileen's world had shifted. The loneliness that once enveloped her like a suffocating fog had thinned, replaced by a fierce determination to protect those she loved, especially Lily. The granddaughters. Laughter filled the small apartment now more than ever, a beacon of hope against years of shadow. The walls around Eileen held memories, some tender, some raw. Photographs pinned carefully in frames, small mementos collected through years of struggle and triumph. She'd started writing again, chronicling her story not as a victim but as a survivor, a woman who bore wounds yet refused to be defined by them. Her mornings began with tea brewed strong, fingers trembling slightly as she wrapped warmth around her hands. She walked to the park where Lily played, watching as the child chased friends beneath bare branches, her bright coat a splash of color against the gray. These moments were fragile jewels, reminders of what had been lost and what might still be saved. One day, Eileen received a letter from a local advocacy group. They wanted her to share her story at a community event aimed at raising awareness about abuse and healing. The invitation stirred nerves deep within her chest, but she recognized the power in speaking out, the chance to turn pain into purpose. Preparing for the talk, she revisited memories long buried, the attic room where she'd hidden as a child, the nights filled with fear and whispered secrets, the long silence that followed her stepfather's heavy footsteps, the moment she had finally run away, heart pounding, desperate to escape a cycle she feared would never end. She also thought of Lily, the way the child's small hands clutched hers after the terrifying revelation, the nights spent holding her close, whispering promises of safety and love. The fight had become theirs together, a shared journey toward healing. The day of the event arrived with a cold gray sky, the kind that pressed down on the soul. Eileen's voice was steady as she recounted her story. The fear, the silence, the escape, and ultimately, the courage to break the cycle. Her words hung in the air, raw and unflinching, touching the hearts of those gathered. There were tears, nods, quiet murmurs of understanding. Among the audience were women and men who had known their own battles, who recognized in Eileen's tale a mirror of their own pain. The community's response was a balm to wounds thought too deep to heal. Afterward, people approached her, sharing their stories, offering thanks, and seeking advice. The isolation she had once felt dissolved in the warmth of shared humanity. For the first time, Eileen sensed that her suffering might have meaning beyond herself, that by telling her truth, she could help others find theirs. Back home, Lily greeted her with a smile that reached her eyes. "You were brave, Grandma," she said simply, her voice full of admiration. Eileen hugged her tightly, feeling the fullness of love and hope swelling inside. The years of silence and pain had not been in vain. They had led her here, to a place where light pierced through darkness, where brokenness could be mended. As winter settled over Millbridge, Eileen found peace not in forgetting the past, but in embracing it, in standing tall despite it. The journey had been long, marked by sorrow and struggle, but also by unyielding strength and love. The attic room above the kitchen was gone now, replaced by a life built on courage and truth. Eileen was no longer a girl hiding from shadows. She was a woman who had faced them and emerged whole. Her story was finished, not with despair but with hope.